a welcome to What Really Matters. And what really matters this week is, of course, Thanksgiving. So what I'm about to tell you is a history of the first years of the original English settlers in the colony of Plymouth. The Pilgrims were men, women, and children whose commitment to God and to his kingdom were really a high watermark for all others. This trek that they were on had begun over 30 years before the Mayflower sailed, when persecution began in England against those who desired to worship God instead of the dead religion of the king and the bishops of England. And it continued for decades after the first dreadful years when the Pilgrims arrived on the shores of the New World. Americans are, woefully ignorant of the sacrifice, the fortitude, and the faith of these men and women who were the first Americans. And this day we celebrate as a national holiday should therefore include an understanding of the cost that was paid willingly by these unknown soldiers of the cross, as well as a heartfelt thankfulness to the one true God who continues to bless our land, even though the heart of this nation has turned far from him. So I encourage you during this time to listen to this brief history and to record it for your children or for those who will be with you this Thanksgiving. America, our beautiful country, has a brief window of opportunity to turn again to God's unique calling on this nation. And it begins with knowing from where we came and the original calling that God placed on us. So what is the history of that first Thanksgiving? Well, to begin with, it started a year before. It was the winter of 1620 when the Mayflower brought the Pilgrims to the New Jerusalem in 66 days of stormy travel. There were 102 pilgrims who were crammed into a space about equal to a volleyball court. Because of the weather, they were below in the middle deck the entire time. The hatches were battened down because of the storms, and the stench was horrific. The travel in the mid-deck of the tiny ship was crammed and without fresh air or sunlight the entire trip. They subsisted on a diet of dried pork, dried peas, dried fish, which barely kept them alive. Most had succumbed to seasickness and, they could hardly eat at all. They were indentured, read into that, they were enslaved to businessmen in London, whose final goodbye was to rewrite their contract only days before their departure. Initially, the debt was 1,800 pounds, but they were so taken advantage of that the 7-year note took over 20 years to pay off at a cost of over 20,000 pounds. Well, these believers bore that unscrupulous debt to the last pence through the grace of God and their integrity. Now, what was their cause? Well, it was very clear. Their cause was freedom to follow God, to take the light of the gospel of peace to the new world, where they covenanted together with God and with one another to prove the gospel through sacrifice, humility, repentance, and an absolute commitment to the scriptures. They set sail from England 3 times before they finally abandoned one ship, and they packed everyone as well as the supplies under the Mayflower and departed for the final time. And during that time, of course, they had eaten most of the reserved food that they had. And they knew that if they were to make a permanent stand in New England, it would be because, in their own words, God works a miracle. It was a bitter cold end of December when they finally stepped off that ship onto the shores of what would be known as New Plymouth. It was named that because that was the name of the town that had been so kind to them on their departure from England. Well, the worst of the weather hadn't taken place yet. And as it began, the weary and terribly sick pilgrims began to build shelters as quickly as they could against the bitter winter that bore down on them. This began the time that became known as the general sickness, as the pilgrims succumbed to scurvy, the cold, and the lack of nutrition. And then the pilgrims started dying. There were 6 dead in December. There was 8 dead in January. On January 14th, the common house where the sick and dying lay caught fire, exposing the sick to more of the bitter winter that had settled in on them. In February, 2 a day were dying. The 21st claimed 4 more lives. March, another 13 died. And by the time that it was all done, 47 people, nearly half their original number, were dead. 13 of the 18 wise had died. But through it all, they remained faithful to God. They continued to lean on their covenant with God and their covenant with each other as they pressed forward, knowing that the current troubles were in no way a reflection of God's love, but an opportunity to stay faithful to what God had called them to do. It was the middle of March as the days began to slowly warm, and an Indian walked into their camp and boomed out in the king's English, "Welcome!" And then he asked for beer. His name was Samoset, and so began the remarkable blessing of the God they served. Samoset sent another Indian to them, Squanto, who told them that the place that they had landed had belonged to his tribe that had been mysteriously wiped out in his absence, most likely by disease. And when he came back to look for his tribe, they were all dead. What was left were fields ready to plant, along with the superstition among the very savage tribes that surrounded them that the land was cursed, so no one would venture to go there. They learned to plant corn. They made a peace treaty of mutual aid and assistance with the Indians that lasted for 40 years. They learned to harvest the fish and the game. They chose to a man to stay in the new land that they had been delivered to by the grace of God. And at the end of that first summer, new homes had been built, as well as common houses for the settlers. Squanto acted as guide and interpreter to the pilgrims, which was one of the greatest gifts from the Father that they had received. Well, it was then that Governor William Bradford declared a day of public thanksgiving to be held in October. The Indian tribe that had befriended them showed up a day early, and they brought 90 Indians. But they also brought 5 dressed deer and more than a dozen wild turkeys. The celebration went on for 3 days. Thus, our national feast day began as a day of thanksgiving after one of the most wretched years of our forefathers' lives. The troubles would not end with that first year, though. In November, the first ship from England, named the Fortune, left off a cargo of 35 more colonists who brought nothing more than the clothes that they were wearing. They brought no equipment, they brought no food, no tools, no bedding. So the following winter was known as the winter of starving. Very soon after that first Thanksgiving feast, all of the colonists went on half rations. And finally, they were only eating 5 kernels of corn each day just to survive. Well, what was their choice? Their choice, as quoted by one of them, was either to give into the bitterness and the despair or to go deeper into Christ. Well, they chose Christ. And in contrast to what happened in Jamestown, not one of them died of starvation. So why a day of Thanksgiving? You know, many people in the world today are simply shaking their fist at God and cursing the day that this new year began. You would think that maybe that they would do that also as they stepped on the shore of this new world. And these pilgrims didn't have a clue as to the tragedies that were going to take place, but instead they declared a day of thanksgiving in the middle of their heart-wrenching losses, in the middle of all that they had taken up. You see, this didn't happen on some foreign mission field. These things took place in what would become the United States of America. Our land was founded on the principles of sacrifice to God, commitment to the cause of Christ, and covenants between God and men, as well as between families. William Bradford, the beloved patriot and the longtime governor of Plymouth, wrote, "As one small candle may light 1,000, so the light kindled here has shone unto many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation. We have noted these things so that you might see their worth and not negligently lose what your fathers has obtained with so much hardship." May his prayer and his hope be realized in our nation over these coming years. Well, happy Thanksgiving. I'm praying for you. Please pray for me.